Hello everyone, welcome again to my channel. I hope you are doing well. In this episode and the upcoming ones, we are going to talk about the CRMEF entrance exam, okay? So this episode and the upcoming ones are devoted for future teachers and those who want to start the teaching profession or those who want to succeed in the CRMEF exam, okay? So in this episode and upcoming ones, I'm going to give you general pieces of information and ideas that would help you, as I said, in both the written and the oral exam, okay? Today, in this episode, we are going to start with talking about some stages, or we can also call them phases we follow or we go through for teaching either a certain lesson or a certain component, or teaching in general, okay, as a process. So the phases or the stages we are concerned with, as you can see, are 1, 2, and 3. So we have 3 general stages or 3 general steps that we go through for teaching, as I said, a specific lesson or specific component, okay? So the first one is what we call planning, okay? So this is number 1. It is planning, okay? And number 2 is something we call management, okay? It is management. And number 3 is something that we call assessment, okay? It is assessment. All right, so this is number 1, this is number 2, this is number 3. Now, the first thing that you have to keep in mind when we talk about these phases is that we cannot start with management, then we go back to planning, then we go to assessment, or we start with assessment, then we go to planning and management. No, this is the order. Planning number 1, management number 2, and assessment number 3. Now, when we talk about planning, it can be considered as preparation. So remember, it is preparation. To prepare what? Very simply, is to prepare the lesson, which means that you have to make a lesson plan. Okay, you have to make a lesson plan. So this is number 2. You make a plan for your lesson. What are you going to do in step number 1? What are you going to do in step number 2? What are you going to do in step number 3? And so on and so forth. So we are going to make a plan, general plan for your lesson. This is number 2. Another thing that you have to keep in mind when we talk about planning is that it is something that we do at home, okay? It is something that we do at home. And when we say something we do at home, it is something that we do before going to classroom, okay? Another thing is that when we talk about planning, we talk about the teaching of lessons. And in other words, when you are preparing a certain lesson, you should be aware of how to teach, all right? How to teach, for example, grammar, how to teach reading, for example, how to teach vocabulary, how to teach perhaps listening, and even writing, for example, okay? How to teach writing. So these are the things that you should be aware of, how to teach these lessons. Why? Because when you are planning one of these lessons. Therefore, to plan one of these lessons, you should be aware of how to teach it and the steps, the activities, the stages that we have in teaching each of these lessons. In the upcoming episodes, we are going to focus on the teaching of these lessons and the steps we have to teach these lessons, all right? So this is for planning. So remember, planning is to prepare the lesson, is to make a lesson plan, and also something that we do at home, before going to classroom, okay? Now, let's talk about this, and this is very important. Lesson plan. Grammatically, when we talk about planning, we talk about the lesson plan. Now, one of the main terminologies and concepts that you have to remember when it comes to lesson plan is that we can talk about objectives, and we can also talk about materials. Then we can also talk about stages, okay? Stages of the lesson. Each of these lessons has specific stages that we follow. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is what we call timing. And when I say timing, I mean time. You have to allocate a specific time for each stage. This is what we mean by timing. For example, this stage will take something like 5 minutes. This stage will take something like 10 minutes, and so on and so forth. Another thing is that when we talk about lesson plan, we also talk about something like strategies and techniques. Okay, strategies and techniques. Strategies and techniques that the student use to learn, student use in each stage or in the lesson as a whole. Okay, another thing, and this can be the last thing or the last one, is what we call the mode of work. When we talk about the mode of work, we mean whether it is a pair work, student work in pairs or in groups, or even individually. So this is what we mean by mode of work. So these are terminologies and concepts related to the lesson plan that we are going to see when we teach, when we talk about teaching of these lessons, and you have to be aware of them. Objectives, materials, stages, timing, strategies and techniques, and finally the mode of work. Okay, all right, now this is for planning. So you finished preparing the lesson, you made a lesson plan. Now what are you going to do? You have to go to the classroom to teach the lesson. Now we talk about management. So management is something that we can consider as classroom teaching. Okay, classroom teaching. All right, this is something that we do in the classroom. We can say while teaching. It is while teaching, but this is something that we can consider as pre-teaching, and this is while teaching. Okay, this is the management. It is classroom teaching. Okay, another thing, management means to put what you planned before into practice. So it has to do with practice. Another thing that we can talk about when we talk about management is it has to do with monitoring and controlling. Monitoring and controlling what? We can say activities, the activities you do in the classroom, or you can also monitor and control the whole class. We can say students, okay? Student and the activities you do or the student, okay? Another thing that management has to do with is what we call classroom management. This is another topic, okay? This is another topic, classroom management. And when we talk about classroom management, we talk about the teacher's arts and the teacher's skills to control the class and to deal with perhaps unexpected problems or disruptive students. So your skills of teaching, your techniques and your strategies that you use in the classroom are all embedded in classroom management. So classroom management is how to manage the classroom, okay? Another thing that management has to do with is the methods and we can say approaches. The methods and approaches you as a teacher use for teaching a certain lesson, okay? Another thing that has to do with management is what we call the teacher's zone. And this is very important to remember, teacher's zone. When we talk about teacher's zone, we talk about the involvement of students and how many students are being involved with you as a teacher, okay? So this is what management is all about, okay? It is something that we do in classroom. It is putting your plan, your lesson plan into practice, and also it has to do with classroom management, to manage your class, and the methods, the approaches you use for teaching, and the teacher's zone involvement and the engagement of student in the lesson, okay? So this is for management, okay? Now you planned, you taught the lesson. Question: did you do well in teaching the lesson? Did your student learn something? This is something that you answer when you do an assessment. So assessment is something that we use to check. Remember to check, okay? So assessment is mostly for checking. For checking what? For checking two things. Number one, for checking as a teacher, your performance. And number two, for checking student learning, whether your student learned something or not. So this is why we do assessment. Another thing, in general, we give two things. The teacher gives two things. Either we give what we call marks, or we can say remarks. So you give marks when it is necessary for a student to pass, okay? To pass from one level to another level. This has to do with marks. Also, you give remarks. And remarks or feedback is very important for improvement. Again, when we talk about assessment, we talk about ways of assessment, okay? We can say ways of assessment. How do we assess students? Normally, you can think of different ways of assessment. And assessment can be done by a single exercise that you can do at the end of the lesson. Single exercise. This exercise, you can consider it as an assessment to check whether students learned something or not. However, we can also talk about different common ways of assessment. For example, like quizzes, or we can also have tests or exams. So these are the three general ways of assessment. Quiz is very short and very small that you can do even after one lesson or maximum after a unit. But when we talk about tests, it's something that covers the lessons and the units you cover during the whole semester, and therefore we have something like global tests. Okay, we have global tests, and global tests is something that we do at the end of semester. Exam is general. It is standard that all students take. For example, the CRMEF exam is an exam, or we can also talk about the National Baccalaureate. It is also an exam. So it is at the end of the year, and all students take this exam. All right. So this is the difference between these ways of assessment. So you can check and learn more about these things, okay? So this is all for today's episode. Planning, management, and assessment. Planning is something that we do at home. It has to do with the lesson plan. And when we talk about management is teaching in the classroom. It is something we do in the classroom. And number three, assessment is to check what you did, whether students learned and whether your performance was good. If you have any question or suggestion about this, you are welcome. And see you in another episode. We are going to talk about how to teach these lessons, give you just ideas and general information to help you in the oral exam or the written exam. See you in another episode. Have a good time and goodbye.